I'm Brian Schiff. Welcome to another show that I guarantee will be full of Schiff. And I hope that you will be entertained as much as you're educated on this program tonight. I'm a 40-year active Gold SEAL flight instructor, still teaching today. And as a side job, I fly for a major U.S. airline so that I can provide for my airplane. So I'm going to be talking tonight about an accident. I got a special guest tonight as well. But before, I'd like to I get asked by a lot of people, why are you doing this? And I answer, well, I'm doing this because I'm giving back to industry. I like teaching. I've learned a lot of things over many years, but I want to make aviation safer. I like to reduce the number of accidents. And I know that accidents are rare, but when they do happen, it's comforting to know that you've got someone behind your back. And in this case of EMCO, which is ponied up to help us produce this show. And I'm especially grateful to them. So it's nice knowing they have your back. And of course, you don't want to go through this, and it's in everybody's best interest not to. So best to avoid an accident. But when the shift does hit the fan, and sometimes it does, EMCO can help you navigate the troublesome waters that follow an accident. But they want to help make safer pilots. So they've sponsored our program because they believe in what we're doing. So I thank them for that, and I try to not let down. So we'll give you as much as we can to help make you safer pilots. So once again, welcome. Remember that tonight's episode is eligible, as all of them are, for Wings credit. If you are not familiar with Wings, you can look at the Wings user guide in the resources guide materials on this webpage, on the main webpage for this program, which I'll go over in a second. Wings credits also apply towards a flight review. If you're working on that, you can get some leniency with the FAA with Wings credits. I once had a runway incursion that was the first one, 15,000 hours into my flying career. And they saw, well, look at all these Wings credits you're participating in. You're obviously trying to educate yourself. It's a good deal. And not to mention that you can also get a lot of discounts with aviation insurance. But the most valuable part is the investment in your own safety. So I encourage participation in the Wings program. And for this, you will get credit tonight. The course resources, the Wings user guide is in there. Subscribe to the SCHIFF Show emails to keep to date on topics and podcasts and the archives. Everything you can find here. You can find the archives. You can click to find out more about EMCO, and everything is there. Tonight, if you want to join the chat and sign in with your name before you post, just click on the chat button at the bottom right corner. After you click on that, you'll click to sign in. Enter your name first. Don't enter what you want to write in the chat first. And then you'll join as your name, and then you can type in the chat. Just I encourage you to be kind, participate in the polls and see results. Now, to see and participate in the polls, you kind of need to be watching live. So if you're watching the recording, that's an encouragement to try to watch this program live. There are also some keyword searches that you can do in the chat, some really neat features that we've got. And in addition to that, some of the words will form hyperlinks. Like if I mention, FAA Safety Team website, it may go to that website simply by clicking on that word in the chat. So with that, let's talk about what we're normally doing on every program is these 5 segments. We'll look at an accident. We'll cover procedures and training, some technology involved. We'll have some quiz questions at the end. But every episode, we'll have these 5 segments. This month, we're going to take a look at an accident, a World War II tragedy that happened, and we're still having accidents today that are kind of similar to this. So we're going to look at some of this and dive deep into it and see what kind of lessons we can learn, and we'll talk about that tonight. And I'm not alone tonight. So tonight, I actually have a guest speaker, Captain Mike Jesch. If you've watched our GNS 101 programs or our 4-flight workshops, you've seen him before. He's an accomplished aviator with over 4 decades of flying experience. He's a Boeing 787 captain. His roots are deep, just like mine in the general aviation world, and getting deeper. So he flies GA. Here's a shot of him flying my Citabria. He earned his pilot certificate while still in high school, just like I did. He's an active instructor. He's been a CFI for over 40 years. He's a 2-time master flight instructor, and he can be found flying his Cessna 182 around the Los Angeles basin, and actually all the way to Oshkosh in the end of July. He, like I like to think I have, has a relaxed teaching style. He's a lead representative for the FAA safety team and has a distinguished honor of receiving the 2025 Long Beach District FAA Safety Team Representative of the Year Award. He also was the 2021 Western Pacific Region Rep of the Year. Mike, welcome. It's so good to have you.
Hi, Brian. Thanks. It's good to be here, and I really appreciate your invitation to be here and talk about this story a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a story you brought to my attention, and we'll get to that shortly. And I think it's a neat one. It's certainly got a lot of valuable lessons that can be learned, and is of an interest for many reasons. So we'll definitely take a look at that. So you learned to fly in high school. I learned to fly in high school.
That was like the same high school?
So 10 years ago for me. How long ago was that for you?
Yeah, I think it was about 11 years ago.
Oh, so 21 years flying experience. Between the two of us, we've flown like a lot of hours, and we've forgotten a lot lot of things.
Yeah, I've forgotten more than you know, for sure.
I've forgotten more than I know.
I think I've forgotten more than I know sometimes, too.
I wish I knew half as much now as I thought I did when I first got my certificate, because I thought, boy, I got it all. But I've learned that this continuing education, every time I watch a lot of other programs as well, and I continually learn from them. So it's really great to have you on board to give another perspective as well. So it's not just me pontificating.
That's always a fun thing for me too. I enjoy other programs with other presenters. I hear a different angle on something. Maybe they put it away, or they talk about a thing that maybe I didn't think about or didn't think about in that way. So right. Maybe we'll get some of that tonight too.
We will. And in our discussions preparing for this, I've even learned some things that, from you as we were discussing this. And sometimes preparing to teach a topic, I dig deep into that topic. And boy, there is no lie. You learn by teaching.
Yep, you can get that shovel out and keep on digging.
Exactly. So, learning is a change in behavior as a result of experience. So we're going to go through 5 questions, the 5 quiz questions that we normally do at the end. We're going to go ahead and launch those now and just show you the questions, have you answer them, and then we're going to kind of review the results later and kind of see what the right answer is. The first question is, what is a sensitive altimeter? Have you ever heard of an altimeter's feelings, Mike? If you talk
usually I've heard them many times, often multiple times on the same landing approach. I've been able to
hold straight level.
Yeah, well, and it just sits there and laughs at me as the dials are spinning all around. It's right. It's comical if it wasn't me and they're trying to hold it still.
Right. This should be something you can push on a check ride to just lock it right in place.
Yeah.
So what is a sensitive altimeter? Either it gets its feelings hurt really easily, or it has only one hand, which moves 1,000 feet per revolution, 10,000 feet per revolution. It has a hand that moves 1,000 feet per revolution, or it's very susceptible to temperature change. So go ahead and answer those. I think you'll see the results in there. And when we get to the end of this program, we'll look at these questions again and talk about them. The next one is, some aircraft used to have engine altimeters. Mike, have you ever seen an engine altimeter?
I have never seen, I think I had heard of an engine altimeter one time, but I've never seen one in an airplane, no.
I often hope that my engine is at the same altitude that I'm at, but it could be something different. What is it? What were these? Were they density altimeters, performance altimeters? Was it a quasi-manifold pressure gauge, or was there no such thing? Are we just making this up? And don't put it past me to do that.
Knowing you, I was just going to say, you're just the kind of guy who would invent something like that. Just make it up out of whole cloth.
It's fun to just watch the reactions of people. What? Really? It's got to be this one. Yeah. Well, don't be. It's not too obvious. All right. We'll move on to question 3. I say again, we'll move on to question 3. The typical GA altimeter cannot be set using a setting in excess of what? What's the highest altimeter setting you can put into a typical GA altimeter? 31?
I usually get mine about 4 or 5 feet above the ground.
Yeah.
Depending on how tall the airplane is.
Right. How many inches is your altimeter above the ground? No, this is what you can get in the Colesman window. What's the highest barometric pressure you can put in the Colesman window? It is one of these, and there is a limit. And actually, believe it or not, there are some procedures in place of what we're supposed to do if the altimeter setting does exceed the limit of industry altimeters. So we'll take a look at that as well.
I got to say, I've never tried to turn mine as far as it would go. So I'm not sure what the limit is on mine.
I haven't until I heard about this, and then I tried it, and sure enough, we'll see what it is later.
Can't wait to hear what you found out.
Yeah. On the ground, an altimeter should read within how many feet of a known elevation while you're sitting on the ground when it is set to a local current altimeter setting. So what's the tolerance is what we're looking for. How many feet off can it be from the altitude or the elevation of where you're sitting? And again, if your airplane is 3 or 4 feet off the ground, you got to consider that, right? So it's either 50 feet, 75, 100, or 150 feet. You want your altimeter to be accurate. We're going to talk tonight about why you want this accuracy, why it's important, especially shooting instrument approaches. So we'll take a look at that at the end.
For sure.
Okay, last one for this and we'll get going. A parked airplane. Your airplane's sitting on the ground. It experiences a dramatic drop in temperature overnight. Its indicated altitude will do what? Will we increase, decrease? We need more information and can't be determined? Or will it stay the same? We've all heard the saying, high to low, hot to cold. Is that at play here? What happens? What is the answer if an airplane's sitting? Have you ever just sat there on an airplane overnight? You ever slept in an airplane overnight?
Oh,
I had to do that once.
I must have. It all kind of, at some point, all the flying and trips that I've done, some of them kind of blend together, but yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if I spend a night in an airplane somewhere. Not counting on my way to Tokyo, I do sleep in that airplane, but I've got a proper bunk facility in there with pillows and blankies, and I got my little stuffed animal.
You're sleeping?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I know somebody's going to go try this on a cold night where it's nice and warm in the evening and spend the night in the airplane and watch your altimeter. I'm not encouraging you to do that, but we'll talk about that at the end of this, and we'll see what you guys said.
And I presume this is with the intention that the altimeter setting has stayed the same, that there hasn't been a weather system move through.
Correct, and that's a good point.
Change.
All things being equal, no earthquakes to raise the elevation or any of Mike's landings to lower the elevation, or no change in barometric pressure. Just the only thing it changes is it gets colder overnight. So, yeah, we'll take a look at that. Well, let's get to it. We're going to start with our first segment, which is the accident review. Regarding the study of accidents, be careful because, the Internet Rapid Response teams are out there. I just want to caution you on accidents that are fresh. Just be careful what you learn. There's a lot of good ones out there. I don't know. What do you think, Mike? Do you see these happens?
I see them all the time. The speculation is rampant, and I'm kind of in a mixed mind about it. I think trying to think about what might have caused it is important, but it's also really important to focus on the actual facts that we know. Yeah. And that we try to approach it from eliminating the things that it might be that you've got some evidence that indicates they're not.
Right.
And then what's left eventually at the end of the process, hopefully, is the truth and what actually happened. And then we try to divine some lessons out of that. And do we need to change our system somehow, or do we need to change our procedures, our training in some way to reduce the likelihood that it happens again? In the end, that's the goal we're aiming for. So,
Agreed. And we're going to look at an accident that happened back in World War II, a long, long time ago. And accidents like it are still happening. So that's why we wanted to put out a message tonight to talk about this accident, which has some interesting aspects to it. But that it happened back then, but for all the technology we have today, we're still having this type of accident happen. So I think it's a great one to look into, and Mike's going to tell us about it. So Mike, why don't you take the controls?
Sure. I got the aircraft. And so a little history lesson here to start with. The Air Transport Command was an organization during World War II that was basically run by the military, but they contracted with commercial airline entities using their aircraft, their pilots, and their ground crews and the whole staff basically to transport personnel and equipment around the country and, in fact, around the world. So this particular accident was a flight using a DC-4, which was a very popular airplane for this, a C-54 in its military parlance. There was C-47s, C-46s were also very common, the DC-3 and I forget what the C-46 was. But and then later on, we got a bunch of others. The Constellation came into play and some others. So the DC-4 was a popular one because it had really good load carrying capability. It had 4 engines, so it had the long legs to make a trip across the ocean, and it could carry a little bit of weight on its way. It was not pressurized, though, so they were still limited to basically about 10,000 feet, and this flight used about 9,000 feet was its cruise for most of the flight.
Wow. Crossing the ocean at 9,000 feet, that's fun. I'd like to have 4 engines if I did it.
4 engines is good, especially the engines of the day there that were reciprocating engines, a lot of piston engines wiggling back and forth there. A lot of things could go wrong with those engines, and I haven't seen statistics on how often engines failed, but nowadays our modern jet engines are much more reliable, and I'd probably rather be on 2 modern jet engines than 4 old reciprocating engines. But there's no doubting the sweet sound of four big round piston engines going. That sounds like nothing else, and it's just terrific. So that was a little bit about the Air Transport Command. Most of the airlines were involved in this, developing the procedures to fly across oceans that we still use today. So this particular flight flew from Stephenville, Newfoundland, Canada, on the very east coast there, just east of Maine, all the way across the ocean over to Prestwick, Scotland, where they were to land there, refuel, distribute the passengers and the load. This particular flight had 13 passengers on board. It had a crew of 6. And there was also 1 civilian on board and 12 service members. And it had almost 1,500 pounds of mail. I have the load manifest from the flight there. They blocked out about 50 pounds below their maximum gross weight. So they didn't really have capacity on this flight to carry a lot of cargo. So it was mostly people and a little bit of mail going across the way. And so we come over here. This is actually the report that I got from this accident includes the weather report. And I thought this was kind of interesting. This is sort of a profile view of the weather that they were encountering along the way. We zoom in just a
profile view.
Very similar to it. We'll see that in just a second. So what I wanted to point out here, across the top, they divided the route into zones. So there's 10 zones on this flight. The second line here is the length, the number of miles that each zone covers. So in this zone 10 here, they would take off in zone 10 and work their way over here to zone 0. And they would actually manually draw a sketch of the kind of weather that they were expected to encounter on that route. And then in the boxes down here, you see the broken layers, the altitudes, the wind speed, and so forth at the various altitudes along the way. So you can see it's going to be pretty cloudy here in the first couple of zones. We come out in toward the center of the flight, and the weather gets a little bit better. And then as we approach toward the back end here, we see a couple more layers of clouds. So right now, not too bad. And I'm making a guess here. I think the reason they use zones was because they could transmit the weather, they make a weather report and refer to the zone that they were in and not the actual position. Remember, this is wartime. This is 1944.
Good point.
And Germany is listening in to all these broadcasts, and we don't want to tip off the actual location. So they use a zone that only the crew and the weather briefers at both ends would know about.
Makes sense.
So I just wanted to slip in here real quick. This is for flight, has the profile view. If you have the top level subscription, you can look at a profile view. So we have similar kind of technology today. And when I'm doing my flight planning, I like to pull this up. There's some other options of things that I can show, but weather and clouds and icing and turbulence are what I've got depicted here. So we still use the same thing. They just did it a little bit.
Yeah, so it looks like those tall, narrow blocks. That's because it's 1,500 miles squashed into a...
Yeah, exactly. So this is a prognosis chart, the forecast chart that was in effect for the flight. They were flying from the Green Star over here in Newfoundland over to the Red Star in Prestwick. And you can see they're crossing a lot of isobars there, lines of equal pressure weather over to here to Prestwick. And that's down there pretty low. 2994 is the altimeter setting right here. They started off at 3021, I think it was. So this is the weather. There were manually drawn pictures, and the crew was issued a copy of this when they were doing their briefing in preparation for the flight. So the report I got included a list of the passengers on board the aircraft.
Hey, wait a minute. That looks a lot like somebody I know. It's that a relative of yours?
That is a relative of mine. This is my hook into this accident, and this is why this was so intriguing to me. I'd always heard since the time I became a pilot that I had an uncle who was killed in the crash of an airplane during World War II.
Wow.
This is that crash. And I Googled all the names on this list when I got this report, and I did a little research on them. I spoke to a lot of my family members, my uncles. All of my uncles and aunts have now passed, but I did get some stories from them about my uncle. He was an aircraft mechanic, and long story there. I don't know that we've got the full time to get into it tonight, but yeah, this is my hook into it. Two other interesting names here. There's one woman on the flight here, Viviana Cronin. She was an Army nurse. Her job on the mainland after the D-Day invasion was to prepare injured soldiers for transport back to the UK for medical treatment to recover from their injuries. She got word that her brother was sick, so she flew back to Montana to visit her brother. He passed already before she got there, but she stuck around for a week or two to help the family for a little bit. She was on her way back into the theater to continue her work in the invasion.
Oh, wow. It'd be fascinating to do a special presentation just talking about all the neat details of this accident. I think we should do that.
That'd be fun. Yeah, I got to do a little bit more research. I'd like to find a little bit more about some of these others.
Sure.
The other name that stuck out to me was this last name. This is a civilian. This was the only civilian on board the aircraft, if you don't count the flight crew. Dr. Harry Berman. He was a mineralogist, and I did a little research on him and found that he had developed a procedure for extracting copper from copper ore. And as I understand it, the process that he devised is still in use in some of the big copper mines in the Southwest and in Arizona. Mm. And he was on his way to Cambridge to give a talk to English mineralogists on this process. So he obviously didn't make that talk. So continuing on in the story here, in the accident weather report here, I want to make sure it's going to advance here to the next slide. Here we go. This is the weather report. They listed layers of clouds in tenths of cloud coverage. So they had an 8/10 coverage of clouds at 900 feet, 2/10 cloud at 700 feet, 10/10 or completely overcast at 1,800 feet, east wind at 12 miles an hour, and visibility about 2,200 yards. So a little bit over a mile, maybe a mile and a quarter, something like that. Moderate rain. There's no altimeter setting listed in this weather report. I found that a little bit interesting. We're going to be talking a lot about altimeters here as we go. So a little bit they were making an instrument approach at Prestwick, and they crashed into a built-up area. We'll get into that in just a second. So for the overview of the accident area, this is an aerial view taken of the Prestwick Aerodrome in 1943, so about a year before this accident. It's a little bit east of the airport, and it's looking toward the west. So they had crossing runways here. The approach that they were doing came in from the northwest corner in this image here, the upper left corner, and it would approach basically this runway 8. It was almost a straight-in approach for runway 8. And the longer one here is runway 1432, and that's going to figure prominently here. They were cleared to make this approach on the southwest leg and then circle basically over to runway 14. The other thing I want to point out is the control tower was right about here, just about a little up and to the right a bit of the center of the image. And then this is the town of Prestwick down here, neighborhood just south of the airport. So that's kind of the overview, the lay of the land. This is the approach plate, or similar to it. I couldn't find an approach plate from 1944. This one is from 1948, and there have been just a couple of changes in the interim. But the idea is the same. In the middle of the image here, we have the range. And this is a radio transmitter that would transmit on a frequency, and it was a directional signal. So if you were on this side, if you were on the left side of the beam, it would be transmitting a Morse code A signal. And if you were on the right side of the beam, it was transmitting an N signal, a November signal. And A happens to be dit-da, and an N is da-dit. And as those two audio signals merge together, if you're exactly on the beam, you hear a steady tone. So on one side, you'll hear an N, the other side, you'll hear an A. That tells you you're off course and which way to turn. You would turn until they both get neutral and get even again, you hear the steady tone. So the procedure was to fly over the station, fly outbound. I believe this chart is depicted with a slightly different course just to make it a little bit more visible. So you'd fly outbound for a prescribed amount of time. In this case, on this approach, it's 6 minutes. You do a procedure turn, and all you instrument pilots know what a procedure turn looks like. Well, this is where they were invented. And then you'd re-intercept your inbound course and fly into the station. So that's the plan. I don't know of any range approaches still around. I did hear a few years ago that there was an airway beacon that was available for some time. I want to say somewhere in the East Coast, but I couldn't find any recent information on that.
It would be fun and nostalgic to go try to fly something like that. Maybe somebody could do that at Oshkosh this year.
It would. That would be fun. So this is a photograph that came out of the accident report. We've highlighted the runway. This is the runway of intended landing. The original approach course was supposed to come here where this green line is. Essentially, that's where that range course would take you. That was the intended course. It happens for some reason they were actually a little bit farther to the west. And we know this because there was an air traffic controller who was expecting the arrival. So he went out on the catwalk of the tower to watch the arrival. He wanted to see the airplane come in. And what he saw was the airplane actually below his altitude. The airport is about 63 feet or so elevation. So the airplane was below his altitude. So clearly way lower than he should have been. And they flew across this is a railroad track right here. There's some telephone lines or power lines right across the railroad tracks or along it. They impacted those wire lines right there. And the eyewitness report said that they struck something and that the airplane started to sparkle and the number 3 engine caught on fire at that location. Also, the accident report indicates that they found both pitot tubes at that location. So probably in that moment, they lost their airspeed indication. So things are going really wrong here really quickly.
That's one you don't see on the written test. What if you lose your pitot tube? I mean, I don't know what kind of indication you'd have, but they didn't climb and they did that turn and crash. So it'd be interesting to
I would guess you go to 0 or a very low. Now you're basically using static pressure for your pitot pressure, so they would zero out, is my hunch.
Makes sense.
So as they continued, just a few seconds later, shortly after that, there was a power pole in a post office parking lot here that they hit, and that took off about 3 feet of the right wing of the airplane. So now we've lost the number 3 engine, the inboard right engine. We've lost the pitot tubes, so the airspeed indication, and we've lost 5 feet of wing on the right side of the airplane. So now things are going really wrong. And so he heard them power up. Presumably they powered up to do a go-around. And I think they basically came into a VMC roll. They went right over the level of the air traffic control facility structure here. I don't think it was a tower like you got depicted here, but that was a nice little diagram you got. Went right over their house, rolled over, and they impacted the neighborhood just south of the airport here.
Wow.
So they hit one house. There was a landing gear impact on one house. It hit across the street. Fire engulfed about 5 houses around there. And this was the newspaper article that was published just a couple days later on September 1st, so 3 days after the accident. 25 people in total were killed. There was the 20 on board the aircraft and 5 on the ground. So it still remains the highest fatality aircraft accident in this area of England. So the accident report came out. This is the official War Department report of aircraft accident that came out. A couple interesting things I found on this. Number one is it came out on 4th of September, 1944, 1 week later. So it takes us a little longer these days to do an accident report than it did then.
A little bit.
So there was a lot of mishaps, so they didn't have a whole lot of time to spend on them. But they still follows the kind of a standard profile that we see in accident reports today. There's a little report on the personnel involved, the man, the machine, the environment. So in this case, we're talking about the flight crew here. This captain had a very good reputation. He was very careful, methodical, and conscientious pilot. So we hear that a lot in airplane accidents. The people around the pilot involved all say, oh, he was a very careful pilot. Nothing like this would ever happen. He had made 10 previous flights to Prestwick, so he'd been experienced on this route. and he had almost 1,000 hours of 4-engine time. I presume he also had some 1 and 2 engine time before that. So he checked over the route from Stephenville to Prestwick by Ralph Dodson, who was the chief pilot of American Airlines. And this is about the time I was reading this accident report when my jaw dropped on the floor. And those of you may know, I have a very close and long connection with American Airlines. This was the other shoe that dropped. I had no idea before I got this accident report that this was the case. So he'd gotten a good check on the route 2.5 months prior. He'd been given an instrument approach check at LaGuardia in February of 1944, where he scored a 91 out of 100. We don't score these tests anymore, but he scored a solid A- performance. Pretty good. So then after we've reviewed the personnel and the situation, now we come to what's the probable cause of the accident, basically. And in this case, they said the determination of the major cause was impossible. So many facts which are undiscoverable. Nobody survived, so we can't get a firsthand account of anybody on board the airplane. They basically boiled it down to, we think there are 2 possible causes. One is an instrument failure, or the vacuum system instruments maybe, or the other is that the pilot error that probably permitted the aircraft to descend to an altitude approximately 30 feet above, so far from the field. And I'm not an expert, but I'm inclined, I'm not a betting man, but I'm inclined to put my money on that second option there. I don't really have any reason to suspect there was an aircraft mechanical thing. So we didn't have cockpit voice or flight data recorders at the time, so we don't have that to go on either. So the other contributing factors they talk about were the weather. The weather personnel on the field said that there was a rain shower had just come through. There were blackout regulations in effect during the war, of course. So all the houses in all the lights in all the houses in the neighborhood there were all turned off. And I should say, we probably didn't say this already, this aircraft accident happened a little bit after midnight on the night of the 28th now of August.
Yeah, a dark town, that can make it even worse, a black hole approach to a runway.
For sure. It changes everything.
Yeah.
So, and then the final thing that we see in accident reports still today are recommendations. So here we have recommendations that radio altimeters are installed in all transport aircraft, and they are now. I have not flown a transport category aircraft that didn't have a radio altimeter. Better means provided for lining up for the approach. And in this case, the only option they had was a range approach. Just a few years later, there was a more modern, it's American system that they talk about, ILS approach was installed shortly later. And that has been the industry standard for 80 years, basically, until just about now. We're starting to see RNAV GPS-guided approaches are supplanting the ILS ones.
Right, but still using the same barometric pressures and altimetry that they used back then.
Yeah, it's still a factor in there. So they wanted better lighting facilities on the runway. They were not using runway 826 that night because they didn't have very good lighting. That's why they were told to land on runway 14. So that necessitated the circling maneuver, which might have contributed a little bit. The obstructions near where they hit did not have obstruction lighting on them. So one of the recommendations was more obstruction lighting. So, it's still the same format. And what I wanted to point out now, you mentioned a little while ago, these things are still happening. I found that this recent story about 1.5 years ago in de Gaulle Airport at Paris, France, there was an A320 that got very close to the ground. And this one was caused by, they got an incorrect altimeter setting from the air traffic controller. They set an altimeter setting that was higher than what the actual setting was, and that led to the aircraft being lower than they thought they were by about 280 feet. So as we continue in this deconstruction here, you do the math on it, they said the lowest altitude they got to was 405 feet if they had had the correct altimeter setting on there, but they were seeing 679, so about 275 feet higher. Their radio altimeter actually showed 6 feet above the ground, and they were almost 2 miles before the runway. So think about that for a minute. You're 2 miles before the runway, and you're 6 feet above the ground. So it's all due to a bad altimeter setting.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit below the profile.
Just a little, yeah.
It's a bad altimeter. And some people may be wondering why the ground proximity warning didn't go off. Well, as you get closer to the airport, the ground proximity warning system expects you to get close to the ground, so it starts alleviating the warnings. And boy, that's really unfortunate. That's just from a bad altimeter setting.
Yep. So altimeter settings are important. Don't just gloss over those. So
yeah. Well, let's some procedures that are in effect now, and I'll let you start on these, and I'll jump in. I'll do the second half of these, but we'll look at the procedures and some aspects of the FAR, the AIM, Pilot Controller Glossary, etc. Publications that are out there now that will help us. So go ahead. Talk about the phases of flight with these recommendations.
So we start with maintaining your aircraft. Before you get in the airplane to go fly, there's a regulation 91411 says that you have to have had your altimeter system inspected in the last 24 months. So that's the 91411 inspection. So you got to make sure you do those inspections. So it's that's before you even get to the airplane. And now we get to the airplane and we listen to the ATIS. We started the engine. We get the ATIS. The ATIS is going to include an altimeter setting. You want to set that altimeter setting right away, and you're looking to see that the difference between the known field elevation and the altitude read from the altimeter is within 75 feet. And that's this is in the AIM, paragraph 723. So 75 feet. If your altimeter indicates more than 75 feet off, it's not accurate enough. You need to go get it inspected, and whoever does the inspection is probably going to tell you there's something wrong with your altimeter.
Yeah.
So continuing on so now we've completed our before takeoff, we take off, we cruise. There's a requirement in 91121 that we set our altimeter as we fly to a station setting within 100 nautical miles of the aircraft. So if you're talking to air traffic control, they're going to give you an altimeter setting. But if you're not monitoring air traffic control, if you're not getting flight following, you're on your own. So here's one way that I've been using lately. I have ADS-B installed in my airplane, so I get local weather. And you can set one of these instruments at the bottom of your map screen in ForeFlight to show you your nearest barometric pressure setting. So that's a great simple way to make sure you've always got the local altimeter setting. So we're moving on to another requirement in cruise. That if you're an IFR pilot and you're flying in Class A airspace up high, if you're in an area that has a low altimeter setting, eventually you get to a point where you have flight levels that are not usable. So if you got an altimeter setting of 2972, let's say, and you filed for flight level 180, you can't use that. You can only use it if you're 2992 or higher. If you're below that, 2991 to 2892, the lowest usable flight level is 190. So just keep that in mind if you're an instrument pilot.
Yeah, that lower altimeter settings like that will take Class A down into VFR, down into 17.5 if you set your altimeter at 2992. That's
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So the other thing I wanted to point out here, the AIM also tells us how to say altitudes. You say 2,000 feet, you don't say 12,000. You say 2,000.
People saying it wrong on the radio, though.
Oh no, so why am I even spending any time on this? But yeah, I hear 12.5, I hear 12.5, I hear all sorts of numbers. But the only correct way to say this is 2,500.
And the the reason we're emphasizing this is because the communication is very likely the cause when people have the wrong altimeter setting. Maybe someone said it incorrectly or didn't use proper phraseology and the readback wasn't right or it was right. In any event, communication is important. That's why we're mentioning this.
Yeah. And same thing with flight levels here. 190 is flight level 190. If you happen to be climbing and you're climbing through 27,500, it's not flight level 27.5, flight level 27.5. It's flight level 275. There are no decimal points in a flight level, and there's no combining digits. So say each individual digit by itself. That's the most accurate way to say it.
Yeah, and you gave me a good piece of advice that I've kind of stuck with. Don't ever say 2 or 4. Climbing to flight level, or climbing to 8,000. I'm not going to 28,000.
Exactly. It's easy to confuse the prepositions 2 and 4 with the numbers 2 and 4. So exactly. So on arrival and approach into an area, there really isn't much good guidance on how to do it. In general, if you're talking to ATC, you should use what they tell you, but make sure that the number you're using is the one that applies for your airport. There it is. So, like for instance, I'll come into the Southern California area. If I talk to SoCal Tracon as I go by Palm Springs, rather, they'll give me the Ontario altimeter setting, even though I'm landing at Orange County or at LAX. So it's not necessarily the destination. So pay attention here. And here's a big one I want to point out. If the number they give you is different than what you thought it should be by more than just a little bit, I use about 0.04, 0.05 inches of mercury. If it's different than what I'm thinking, I need to ask why. Did they give me the correct number? Is the weather changing significantly? Is it the number for the correct airport? Any one of those could be the factor why you got the wrong number, and you need to investigate. Maybe ask the controller, hey, can you confirm what that altimeter setting is? And they'll tell you what to reread it again and get you the right number.
Right. So A, expect what it should be, and B, reconcile when it's different.
Right. Next is in the crew environment I fly in at work. Actually, I flew with a co-pilot a couple of weeks ago who said, they used to take a big Sharpie and they read the ATIS. We get our ATIS on paper. They'd write in big Sharpie numbers the altimeter setting at the top of that. So it was very obvious. He stopped doing that because if he made a mistake on there, that would be a single point of failure where both the pilots flying the airplane might set the wrong number. So his point was, and I agree with him, I think it's a good point, is each of us are responsible or should be responsible to look at that weather ourselves and determine what the number should be.
And you get redundancy that way.
Exactly. Another opportunity to catch the error. And the last thing I want to point out here is when you're on an instrument approach, an ILS, something with vertical guidance, LPV approach or RNP approach, when you cross the final approach fix, verify that your aircraft's altitude is what it should be according to what's on the chart. If you're different by a little bit, more than about 75 or 100 feet, start asking yourself why. Am I really too high? Do I have the correct frequency dialed in? Am I looking at the right chart? It could be any number of things, but check that altitude. If it's not right, start asking questions. If you can't resolve it quickly, you might consider doing a go around and getting it resolved and then try it again.
Right. And that advice is great, not only for IFR pilots, but also for VFR pilots alike, because VFR pilots, if you're going to an airport that you routinely go to, know that, hey, I should be over this building at 1,000 feet. I should be over this road 300 feet. Just know some guidance for what a normal approach would be, because if you have a bad altimeter setting, you might recognize it when that happens.
Right.
One very important thing we need to talk about is the standard atmosphere, and the standard lapse rate is 2 degrees Celsius temperature, 2 degrees Celsius or 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit per 1,000 feet. So a standard temperature at sea level is 15 degrees, and as you go up, it goes down 2 degrees every 1,000 feet. Likewise, the standard atmospheric pressure is, 1 inch, approximately 1 inch change of barometric pressure per 1,000 feet of altitude change. And our altimeters are made to show that difference. So when you start with a standard pressure at sea level of 29.92 inches of mercury, going down 1 inch per 1,000 feet, that's kind of what it looked like. Now, if you're taking off out of airport elevation of 2,000 feet, the barometric pressure there on a standard day is 27.92. But if they tell you that, they can't be your altimeter setting, because if you put that in the window, remember, an altimeter tells you how high you are above whatever's set in the window in basically 1 inch per 1,000 feet ratio. So they have to take that pressure at their airport, 27.92, calibrate it for the 2,000 foot elevation of that airport by taking, adding 2 inches to that to give you the sea level pressure. And then that turns it into an altimeter setting of 29.92 inches. So when you set 29.92 inches in your Coleman window and you're sitting up here at 2,000 feet on this airport, the altimeter looks, hey, the pressure on my altimeter right now I'm sensing is 2 inches different than that. So I'm going to indicate you're 2,000 feet above that place where the altimeter, where the barometric pressure is 2992, because that's what's set in the window. We have to be careful when it's colder than standard. our atmosphere is hardly ever standard. So it's always going to be warmer or colder. The lapse rate changes at a different pace. But a non-standard temperature will affect the altimeter, and it depends on the altitude of the altimeter above the reporting station. A non-standard temperature does affect the lapse rate, so less than 1,000 feet per inch when it's colder, and it's more than 1,000 feet per inch when it's hotter. So the atmosphere is compressed when it's colder into less than 1 inch per 1,000 feet. So on a non-standard temperature on the ground will not display a difference because you have no difference in that compactness between the altimeter and the reporting station. So the higher you are above that station, the more this cold temperature will have an effect. And also know that the AIM has cold temperature corrections and procedures. Just know that it's in there. If you operate in an area where it's very cold, you should study this and be familiar with it. Some airports, won't even let you fly unless you make a correction on instrument approaches. So you've got to make a correction if if the temperature here is below 13 degrees centigrade. The government chart looks a little bit different, and it has a snowflake with the limiting temperature above it. Like if you're going to this airport, the snowflake indicates there's a cold temperature airport. There's special procedures, and if it's below that minus 13 degrees centigrade, you need to apply a correction. Also, the standard, just to give you an idea that the further away you are from that reporting station, the bigger the error is. So this is your height above the airport that's giving you the temperature. If you're 5,000 feet and it's minus 50 degrees centigrade outside, that's a pretty big difference. You can see that's the biggest number we see here. Those are pretty extreme, but it's not uncommon to be maybe 2,000 or 3,000 feet above and maybe minus 30 or 40. These numbers are significant if you're shooting an ILS approach where the minimums are 200 feet. Or if you think you're going to clear a mountaintop by a few hundred feet or 500 feet, but maybe you're not because the altimeter has some error in it. So if you look at a cold atmosphere, it kind of looks like this, where 1 inch per 1,000 feet on a standard day, but as you fly into that cold weather, that each inch is getting smaller and smaller to less than 1 inch per 1,000 feet, and you're kind of following it downhill and actually descending, which is why we've heard that phrase, right? High to low, hot to cold. Some instrument approaches also may not be flown when the temperature is below a certain value. If we look at Idaho Falls, Idaho, it says for uncompensated baro nav. In other words, you're using an approach or GPS procedure that is not giving you a lateral position for that altitude. You can't fly this approach if it's colder than minus 27 degrees Celsius. I'll tell you, I wouldn't want to be there if it's colder than minus 27 degrees Celsius. Other charts have restrictions that prohibit in extreme temperatures as well. Again, the communications Mike was talking about, 12,500, 2,500. Please say things correctly. Be a little bit anal about that because it's important and it's what other people expect to hear. And when they expect to hear something, but they hear something different, it may be totally different than what you said. Likewise, 24,700 feet is not flight level 24.7. It's flight level 247. It's incorrect, but it's often said. Also, I know we've got a lot of stuff to cover. We'll probably go a little bit long tonight, and well, for that we apologize, but we'll make up for it next month and be as on time as we can. We won't go too far, but it might be a little bit. So, at the end of an instrument approach, you must see a bunch of things or certain things to go below a certain altitude. That's all spelled out in the regulations in Part 91. What you have to see to go below your minimums and go land. And Mike, you said that you're seeing a common mistake out there.
Yeah, I see a lot of instrument pilots will say that the only thing two mistakes. One is they say, I need to see the runway environment. And nowhere in this reg does it say runway environment. It lists specific items that you must see at least one of those. That first one is the approach light system. So you got to see the approach light system. If you see that, one of the other mistake I hear is people say you can go down another 100 feet. And that's not what the reg says. The reg says you can continue your descent to not less than 100 feet above the ground. So just on a 200-foot decision height approach, it's no difference. But there are many approaches that have a 250-foot decision height or 300-foot decision height. So
right, significant difference. Important to differentiate for sure. But know that that's there. So those are kind of the regulatory things that we've talked about. Some of the training aspects that I like to talk about when I'm teaching, we'll go over some of those. Then we'll talk about some tech and get into our game questions. As far as the altimeters, there's a lot of different kind of altimeters. Just like Mike has a great presentation on all the different kinds of air speeds there are. I recommend you see that sometime. But there are different kinds of altitude. The true altitude is just the distance between the airplane and sea level. It's your actual height above sea level, a number we rarely know about. The pressure altitude is your height above the datum plane 2992. Again, like I said, whatever you set in the Colesman window on your altimeter dutifully tells you how high you are above where it is that pressure. So for aircraft above 18,000 feet in the U.S. or in Class A airspace, all aircraft set 29.92 because it's not about avoiding terrain so much, but now it's about avoiding other aircraft. So if we all have the same reference level above where the pressure is 29.92, the standard pressure, then we're all doing the same thing. We're all relatively at the same distance off our true altitudes, but collision avoidance is why we do that. Indicated altitude is what your altimeter indicates when you have something set in your window. It tells you the height above whatever's set in your window when you set the current altimeter setting, which a tower will tell you and convert their barometric pressure for their elevation and give you an altimeter setting. And then that will be your indicated altitude. The absolute altitude is what a radioaltimeter would tell you. It's your actual height above the ground below you. Last one, density altitude, is basically mathematically, it's what the airplane feels. The airplane doesn't know the distance between you and the ground or you and sea level, but the airplane knows that a certain density of air, well, we have different density calculations for different temperature and pressures, and that's all density altitude is. It's basically your pressure altitude corrected for a non-standard temperature. So it's what the aircraft and engine feel in their performance. One thing I like to caution you, Mike mentioned before, if an aircraft using a higher altimeter setting than actual, when you talked about that Airbus in France, if you're using a higher altimeter setting than it actually is, let's say you take off somewhere and the pressure dropped all the way there and it's an inch lower at your destination, but you never changed your altimeter, you would be 1,000 feet lower than you think you are. So again, if you have an altimeter setting in your window that's higher than what it is outside, you will be lower than what's indicated. The bottom line is that when you turn that Colesman knob to a lower setting, the altitude that's indicated by the altimeter goes down. When you turn it to a higher setting, a higher altimeter setting, you're winding the altimeter altitude up as well. That's a fundamental that when a lot of questions, if you haven't taken a written test yet, or you're working on your private, commercial, or instrument, you get these altimeter questions, just remember that when you turn it to a higher pressure, the altitude goes up. When you turn it to a lower pressure, the altitude goes down. And then the second thing you need to remember is that the altimeter tells you how high you are above whatever you've set in that window. So knowing that, there's a little just fun Quizlet as we go along here. You're descending out of Class A airspace and you forgot to reset your altimeter to the current barometric pressure setting, which is 29.42. Pretty low, but that's the altimeter setting where you're going. What will your actual MSL altitude be when your indicated altitude reads 850? So remember, your altimeter is set to 29.92 because that's what we set in Class A airspace. So remember that when you turn the knob to a lower pressure, like if you were to take it from 2992 and turn it down to 29.42, the altitude is going to go down also. So when you set the correct altimeter of 29.42 and the altitude goes down, you just changed it by about a half an inch from 2992 to 2942. Remember, 1 inch per 1,000 feet. So you moved it a half an inch, and a half inch is 500 feet. So if we're at 850 feet with an altimeter set half an inch off, 500 feet, we're actually going to be at 350 feet. So the memory aid that you've all heard about is high to low, hot to cold, look out below. And that's a good mnemonic to help you remember that when you fly into those areas, you are actually losing altitude when you're flying in the colder. And when you're flying into an area of low pressure, you're losing your actual altitude above the ground is actually less than what you think it is. Again, the altimeter, what it does, it just displays the height above the pressure datum that you've set in the Colesman window. And Paul Colesman invented the barometric altimeter, which was a key innovation that enabled pilots to safely fly blind using instruments alone, because you could now set an accurate altimeter setting for where is the ground, what's the pressure on the ground. I want to know how high I am above the ground, so I need to know what the pressure is there to know that, and that was kind of cool. Another interesting factoid is that, and I like to teach this when I'm teaching mountain flying, is that around the mountains you'll often see some really fantastic altimeter settings, and these errors are the greatest when you're flying over the mountains, because the mountains actually create a bit of a Venturi effect with the air above and the mountain, and the air flows through there, which we know in a Venturi, air speeds up, pressure goes down. And so you'll see a lot of fantastic and great errors when you go through, do some mountain flying. So technology, the altimeter is not a great thing. It's actually quite simple and hasn't really changed a lot over time. It still kind of does the same thing, but remember, a sensitive altimeter is one that tells you, has a hand that measures 100 feet increments to a total of 1,000 feet in one revolution of that hand. And you can see on the left, that is such an altimeter, which is what we typically have now as a sensitive altimeter. The non-sensitive altimeter on the right that you see, that hand would go one revolution around that altimeter is 10,000 feet. So each of those numbers is 1,000 feet. This one would be indicating 9,000 feet or 1,000 feet below sea level. So Mike, you got some advice for, shooting during the approach phase of a flight?
Yeah, I'm a big tech head, so I use all the tools available. I have a lot of alerts. For instance, I have, in addition to alerts that are built into the airplane, there are alerts that are built into ForeFlight. And I like to turn on the audible alerts. I like to have it speak the alerts aloud. And sometimes I'll have it use just the speaker in the iPad. Sometimes I'll have it Bluetoothed into my headset. But it will tell me when I'm 500 feet above the ground. So that's a good cue to me. When I hear that, I recheck, just double check, make sure my landing gear is down and green, my landing checklist is complete. If I get that 500 feet alert and I'm not expecting it, then I got to start thinking about, where am I? Am I where I think I am? So it's just, when these alerts happen, don't just ignore them and let them go by.
And using those regularly, doing it the same way every time, will also establish a habit pattern for safety, which I will do a shameless plug for next month when we have Jason Miller on the program. We'll be talking about SOPs that you can use, and you do them every time, and it'll make something going wrong will jump out like a big red flag.
Yeah, my students, when I fly, especially those pilots who fly complex airplanes with retractable landing gear, know if I don't hear them say, gear check down in green, somewhere below 1,000 feet, I'm going to call for a go-around when we get to about 100 feet over the runway. So another piece of tech some people have gotten is a landing height system. You can install this in the airplane, usually in an inspection panel on the bottom side of the wing. It's a light system that will, it's sort of like a radio altimeter. It's usually wired into an audible alert somewhere inside the airplane and tell you at some altitude, a preset altitude, that you need to check gear. So ForeFlight will also do yellow or red terrain shading based on your altitude. And you can't check your gear down in green too many times. I do it a lot.
So right. And I'd never heard of the landing height system until you showed me that. If you haven't heard of it, look it up. It's a neat feature that gives that kind of radio altimeter technology to GA airplanes.
Right. So moving on over here to ForeFlight, I just talked about the alerts here. If you go into the settings mode, you can turn all your alerts on, have it speak them all, make sure your volume is up. And these are the sorts of alerts it'll put on the screen. It'll tell you when you're at your transition altitude. Other alerts will pop up. And then, as I showed earlier, if you have ADS-B in source, you can set it up to show you what the local altimeter setting is. So what do you know about radio altimeters, Brian, since that was a recommendation?
I love it. I like the light system for the altitude alerter for a GA. It's just a radio system, sends a beam down to the ground, bounces back to the airplane. The airplane knows the speed of sound. It knows how long it took that beam to go down to the ground and back, and basically gives you your absolute altitude, which is on all airliners and most charter aircraft today, which enables them to do some really precision Category 2 and 3 approaches down to some pretty low minimums, sometimes with enough redundancy. No minimums. You just have to have all systems working. And both aircraft that Mike flies at work and the aircraft I fly can land in an instrument system where we don't have any visual cues. We just have to ensure electronically that the aircraft is in the right place and will touch down on the runway where it's supposed to. Another great thing that a lot of GA airplanes have, the 210 I fly has this, an altitude alerter. If you have it, use it. It's a great tool. You set where you're going, your goal altitude, and it'll ding 1,000 feet before you get there. I think Mike and I were both talking. I wish it was maybe 500 feet in some GA airplanes. But I also use that, and again, another SOP, one we'll talk about with Jason next month, is that when I get the altitude alert saying, hey, 1,000 feet to go, I'm sterile cockpit between then and my level off, because a lot of altitude busts happen as a result of pilots, getting distracted during the level off. But it'll also warn you as you get away from your altitude. If your autopilot kicks off and you didn't realize it, the airplane starts descending, the altitude alerter will once again make an audible alert and a visual warning when you get off the altitude that you were assigned.
Yeah, it's basically the alert that you need to break your pen out and get ready to copy a phone number because you're about to get a brochure warning.
That's right. Or pencil. Yeah, exactly. So that brings us to game time. We're going to take a look at those questions again and do the polls, and we're going to say, okay, let's see how you did on this, and we'll actually look at the answer. Once again, these questions come from my favorite flight instructor, Barry Schiff. Yes, we're related. He's my son. If he owes you money, I don't know the guy. If he doesn't owe you money and you like him, yeah, that's my dad. So, Dad, thanks for this. It's where we get a lot of our questions from. And the first one was, what is a sensitive altimeter? Well, we covered that. I don't think the altimeter can get its feelings hurt. I did have a student one time on an instrument lesson, and if you're watching, you know who you are. They were really over-controlling on an ILS approach, and I said, look, those instruments are very sensitive. Make smaller inputs. And he said, he bends over and apologizes to the instrument. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. I just thought that was a crack up. I never stopped laughing about that one. So yeah, as we know, a sensitive altimeter, and we discussed this earlier, it has a hand or an indicator that revolves one revolution for 1,000 feet. The non-sensitive one has a 10,000 feet for one revolution of the needle.
Some of those altimeters will have two hands. One of them moves at 1,000 feet and one of them moves at 10,000 feet per revolution. But some also have a drum number indicator for the thousands and then the hand that goes around. So right. In either case, it has at least one hand, and one of those hands moves at 1,000 feet per rev.
Exactly. So there are some that have one hand that are still sensitive altimeters. So our next question, some aircraft used to have engine altimeters. You're probably thinking, what? An engine altimeter? What was that? Well, leave it to Dad to back when, he learned to fly, I guess these were normal. I don't know that. I'm just kidding, Dad.
You're going to get it tonight.
Yeah, I know. There was my allowance this month.
Yeah.
So some aircraft used to have these engine altimeters. What is an engine altimeter? Well, it's a quasi-manifold pressure gauge, because these were manifold pressure gauges that indicated the altitude corresponding to the pressure produced in the intake manifold of a supercharged engine. For example, a manifold pressure of 28 inches was indicated by an engine altitude on that engine altimeter of 2,000 feet. Then I guess they got smart and said, why? We don't really care what altitude is. We just care about what pressure is in the manifold. And so now we have manifold pressure gauge. So question 3. A typical GA altimeter cannot be set using a setting in excess of, and it's one of these. Most GA altimeters will not go to this. In fact, I tried it at work. The airliner, the older ones will not go above this either, but the newer ones will, for whatever it's worth. But 31 inches, that is as high as you can set your altimeter. You don't believe us? Try it. I don't know that I've ever seen an altimeter setting greater than 31 inches. But there also is a section in the AIM, go check it out, of what you're supposed to do. If you ever encounter an area where the altimeter setting is greater than 31 inches, a NOTAM will be issued for what area it's in, and special procedures will be in place for that, where all aircraft will set 31 inches operating in that area. So go check that out. Be familiar. It's in the AIM. Let's see. I thought I had the regulation, but I guess I don't. On the ground, an altimeter should read within how many feet of a known elevation when it is set to the current altimeter setting. Well, Mike talked about that, so I think we know what that answer is. If you're going to remember, if you weren't nodding off at that time, then
I was.
So just to be clear, airplanes on the ground, you set the altimeter setting for that airport. And you kind of need to know, like, what is the highest point? Do you know, Mike, do you know the highest point? What altitude, when you see the elevation of an airport, the field elevation published, do you know where on the airport that number exists?
Yeah, there's a little dot on the taxiway diagram, or the ARP, the airport reference point.
No, it's not. A lot of people think that. It's not the airport reference point. The field elevation given, the published as the field elevation for that airport, is the highest elevation on any usable landing surface. So highest elevation on any usable runway. So you need to compensate for where you are and be able to reconcile the difference. But the answer is 75 feet. Your altimeter needs to be accurate to 75 feet. If not, the AIM says you should consider it bad. Something's wrong with it, and you should have it looked at. All right, our last question. A parked airplane experiences a dramatic drop in temperature overnight. Its indicated altitude will do what? Now, we talked about this. I know we showed this question at the beginning, and then during the program we discussed this. The higher you are above the reporting station, the bigger that error is. So we're talking about all things being equal, pressure staying the same, the airplane staying in the same place. Only the temperature is dropping and the altimeter is not moved. Actually, it will be difficult to determine. It cannot be, it will remain the same. I'm sorry. I scratched that. I was distracted by the wrong answer, as we all are. It will remain the same. There is no error because the altitude of the airplane is the same as the altitude of the reporting station. So you won't see it. And if you don't believe me, spend the night in an airplane on a cold night. Don't touch the altimeter and just watch it as the night progresses. You won't see it change. So let's get to our closing thoughts. And Mike, I know you had a picture here.
I did, yeah. This is a photograph of my dad's family. This is taken earlier in that summer of 1944. My dad's over there all the way on the right, and he was a senior at UNR that year in electrical engineering. He hadn't joined the Navy yet. That was next year. But over there on the left is my Uncle Ernie, who is the uncle who was killed in this accident. So, we're looking at something 80 years old. It looks like just a list of names and just a bunch of facts about how it happened. But, these aircraft accidents, we need to remember when we're looking at them, these are real people involved, real families were affected, and just keep that in mind. So this happened 15 or so years before I was born. I never got to know my Uncle Ernie. So I kind of wish I had. We probably would have gotten along just fine.
And you might have had cousins, too. You never know what would have happened.
Yeah, exactly. I've already got 50 cousins in that family, so who knows how many.
Oh, my gosh. I, like you, take safety very seriously when I go to work. I try to be the best I can, do the best I can, continually educate myself so that when I encounter something out of the ordinary, I'm ready for it at work. And we just know that when people get on our airplanes, even if you're in a GA airplane with passengers, they are entrusting you with their lives.
Yep, exactly. So another little tidbit I found out after I got this accident report and started looking into it, I had read Fate is the Hunter a long time ago. And especially if you're a newer up-and-coming pilot, if you have not yet read this book, you really need to. And if you're an airline pilot who has not read this book, I'm going to take away your credentials. This really ought to be mandatory reading. But it's a story about a series of little vignettes of incidents that happened to Ernie Gann, the author, or other people that but for a little tiny twist of fate might have gone very differently. And so it's just interesting. You want to keep those twists of fate. But the interesting thing that was pointed out to me later on is early in the book, there's a dedication section that it's a series of 5 pages of a list of names. These are all the captains of aircraft that had accidents during the war in the Air Transport Command. And the pages started out there with, "To these old comrades with wings forever folded." And then the list of names. And at the end, he wrote, "Their fortune," or you might say fate, "was not as good as mine." And right in the middle of that list is this Captain Golden, who was the captain on this flight, in this Air Transport Command flight number 171 that night. Wow. So it's still in there. It's memorialized in a lot of different ways. Another way, I had walked by this plaque at our flight academy for at least 15 years and never really looked at it. It was just another plaque on a wall full of plaques. And a friend of mine, actually just retired this month, said, "Go take a look at that plaque, Mike." And I looked at that plaque, and this is a dedicated to the crews from the airline who were killed in Air Transport Command Service. ATC at the top of that there does not stand for Air Traffic Control. It stands for Air Transport Command. And here is the crew of this flight listed on that plaque. And then for the final remembrance here, I just found this out when I was preparing for this program here. Just about a year and a half ago, there was erected in the town of Prestwick a plaque here commemorating this event. As I mentioned, it's still the highest fatality airplane accident in the area up there, and they're setting up these series of memorials and notice about event in the area, and there's that plaque. And it's on my short list of things to do when I ever visit Scotland. I got to go see that.
Well, that's a fascinating story, and it's neat to have a personal touch like that went along with it. Mike, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us on this program and giving the insight into that accident and some of the instruction that you give today. And there's no way we could pack into a 1 hour all the information we'd like to. In fact, we didn't. We went a little bit over, and I apologize for that. But thank you, Mike, for joining us and your help in presenting tonight's SCHIFF show. So it's not just...
And I thank you for inviting me on. It's an honor to be your first guest on the program here. And I got to say, I really enjoyed working with you on preparing this and honing the message and helping me figure out the lessons that we can take out of it. So thank you.
You bet. And I enjoyed it as well. And we'll do more for sure. Next month, we are going to have Jason Miller from the Finer Points on, and we're going to talk about SOPs. And he and I have done that before. We've promised some general SOPs for GA pilots for personal flight operations policy manual that you can kind of modify to be your own. We're going to talk about that, and we're finally going to come out with that. So join us next month on May 8th at 7 p.m. or watch anytime on the SCHIFFshow.tv. Notably, also, you can join late. If you can't join us right at 7 p.m. Central Time, you can come in a little bit late, and it will start at the beginning, and you'll see the entire program. You just won't be able to participate in the live polls. A special thank you to our friends at Avemco who made this possible. Again, I'm super appreciative. I want to help them have less claims. Thank you to John Typen from APT for producing this program and helping. My ForeFlight workshops taught me not to do that myself. You remember that, Mike? You can present.
Oh, yeah.
You can produce. You can't do both. Also, very special thanks to the Wings Industry Network and the FAA safety team, both for helping make this possible. So to everybody, remember, have a great night and remember 2 speeds.